that first $10,000 you accumulate will be the hardest money you ever save. And I don't care what you have to do to get it. If it means walking everywhere and eating nothing that wasn't purchased with a coupon, find a way to get your hands on that first pile of capital. Here's what nobody tells you about crossing that threshold. Something fundamental shifts in your psychology. Money stops controlling you, and you start controlling money. Getting together even $10,000 from a standing start at zero remains a long struggle for most people. But the ones who reach this milestone quickly share three traits. They're passionate about being rational, very eager and opportunistic, and they steadily underspend their income grossly. That last word matters because I don't mean slightly and I don't mean modestly, grossly. What I'm going to explain today is why this initial accumulation changes everything, why the mathematics of compound interest ranks among the most valuable models on earth, and why the psychological transformation that occurs when you have capital ends up worth more than the capital itself. Most people have this backwards because they think the point of getting rich is buying things like Ferraris, fancy houses, and status symbols that impress strangers. That's not the point at all. And the real point of getting wealthy is independence. The point is so you don't have to need other people, so you don't have to get along with people you don't want to get along with, and so you can walk away from any deal, any job, or any situation that doesn't serve you. I didn't intend to get rich because what I wanted was independence, and I just overshot. That distinction between wanting riches and wanting independence marks the difference between a life of quiet desperation and a life of actual freedom. Let me show you how this works. Consider a man at age 29 who just went through a divorce, lost nearly everything, including the family home, moved into what can only be described as dreadful bachelor quarters, and drove an awful yellow Pontiac around town. His young daughter once asked him why he drove such a terrible car, and his answer revealed everything about his psychology. He told her it was to discourage gold diggers. Here's a man who had nothing and was already thinking about protecting whatever he might accumulate in the future. No feeling sorry for himself, no blaming his ex-wife or the economy or his bad luck, just a mind already positioned for the next phase. 2 years later, at age 31, this same man buried his 9-year-old son, who died of leukemia. No health insurance existed to help him, so he paid all the medical expenses out of pocket. A friend recalled watching him hold his dying child, then go out walking the streets crying. At 31 years old, he was divorced, broke, and burying his child. What matters now is what you do with that kind of devastation, because life will deliver terrible blows. Horrible blows that are completely unfair, and it doesn't matter if you're a good person or a smart person or a hard-working person. The terrible blows come anyway, and some people recover while others don't. This man's approach proved instructive because he later explained his philosophy. Every missed chance in life was an opportunity to behave well. Every missed chance in life was an opportunity to learn something. And your duty was not to be submerged in self-pity, but to utilize the terrible blow in constructive fashion. He kept going and remarried, raising 8 children along the way. By the time he was 38, he had accumulated roughly $300,000 in assets, which represented about 10 years of family living expenses. That foundation enabled him to start his own law firm and his own investment partnership in the same year. His partnership returned 37% annually before fees, and he eventually became a billionaire. But here's the critical insight. The path from broke and burying his son to billionaire started with the decision to keep accumulating capital no matter what. Not because he wanted to be rich, but because he wanted to never be dependent again. He found it undignified to have to send invoices to other people, and he found it undignified to need anyone. He didn't know where he got that notion from, but he had it. If you have to walk through the streets crying for a few hours a day as part of the soldiering through, go ahead and cry away. But you can't quit, and that's what matters. You can cry, but you can't quit. Let me explain why the first $10,000 is disproportionately difficult and disproportionately important. Getting wealthy works like rolling a snowball, and it helps to start on top of a long hill. Start early and try to roll that snowball for a very long time, because it helps to live a long life. $0 in the bank means that saving $1,000 represents infinite mathematical progress, but very little practical progress. That $1,000 sitting in an account, earning even 10% annually, which is optimistic, gives you $100 a year. That's $8 a month. And that changes nothing about your life. When $10,000 earns 10%, you get $1,000. And while that's still not life-changing, your money is now doing work equivalent to a part-time job. $100,000 earning 10% means $10,000 a year, which becomes a meaningful supplement to your income. But here's the part most people miss entirely. The first rule of compounding is never interrupt it unnecessarily. The elementary mathematics of compound interest ranks among the most valuable models on earth, and yet people interrupt it constantly. They interrupt it because they want a new car. They interrupt it because they're bored. And they interrupt it because their neighbor just bought a boat and they feel envious. The big money is not in the buying and selling, and the big money sits in the waiting. When asked about success in investing, my honest answer is that I succeeded because I have a long attention span. That's it. Not because I'm smarter than everyone else, and not because I have secret information. I can sit still longer than other people. This is why reaching that initial threshold matters so much, because once you have $10,000 or $20,000 or $50,000, you start to feel the compounding. You start to see your money making money, and this changes your psychology in a way that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. You stop thinking about money as something you spend and start thinking about it as something that works for you. Every dollar becomes a little employee that never sleeps, never complains, and never takes vacation. Most people live with what can be called a payday to payday mentality, where money comes in and money goes out. They never accumulate enough to feel the compounding, and they never cross the psychological threshold where money stops controlling them. Let me put this in concrete terms because the math is eye-opening. If you save $500 a month starting at age 35 and earn 7% annually, by age 65 you'll have roughly $600,000. But here's the interesting part. You only contributed $180,000 of that total, and the other $420,000 came from compounding. Your money made more than twice as much money as you did, but that only works if you don't interrupt it. And every time you raid your savings for a vacation, or a car upgrade, or a kitchen renovation, you're not just losing the money you took out, you're losing all the future compounding that money would have done. This is why getting to the first 10,000 matters, and it's not the 10,000 itself. It's the psychology that develops when you start to understand what that 10,000 can become if you leave it alone. Now let me tell you something that might be uncomfortable to hear. The world is not driven by greed because it's driven by envy. I have conquered envy in my own life, and I don't envy anybody because I don't give a damn what someone else has. But other people are driven crazy by it. Envy is a really stupid sin because it's the only one you could never possibly have any fun at. There's a lot of pain and no fun, so why would you want to get on that trolley? Think about the other sins for a moment. Gluttony means at least you enjoy the meal. Lust involves obvious pleasure. And sloth means you get to rest. But envy brings pure poison with no upside whatsoever. You make yourself miserable, comparing your situation to someone else's, and you get absolutely nothing out of it except the misery. Here is one truth that your typical investment counselor would disagree with. If you're comfortably on your way to financial independence and someone else is getting richer faster than you by investing in risky stocks, who cares? Someone will always be getting richer faster than you. And this is not a tragedy. But people can't accept this reality. They see their neighbor making money on cryptocurrency or meme stocks or whatever the current speculation happens to be, and they abandon their rational plan to chase the same returns. They interrupt their compounding and take on risk they don't understand, and very often they end up worse than if they had done nothing. The modern world proves particularly toxic for this kind of thinking. If you take the current environment where people are trying to teach you how to come in and trade actively in stocks, I regard that as roughly equivalent to trying to induce a bunch of young people to start off on heroin. It is really stupid. These get-rich-quick gurus teaching young people to trade are selling poison disguised as opportunity, and they make their money from your activity rather than from your success. Every trade generates fees for someone. Every subscription to a trading service generates revenue for the seller. And the more you trade, the more they make, regardless of what you make. The honest path is boring and goes like this. Spend less than you make. Always be saving something. Put it into a tax-deferred account, and over time, it will begin to amount to something. This is such a no-brainer. But people don't want to hear this because they want excitement. They want to feel like they're doing something clever, and they want to tell their friends about the hot stock they bought. The people who get wealthy quietly, the ones who end up with actual financial independence, are usually the ones you never hear about. They drive reasonable cars and live in the same house for decades. They don't talk about their investments at parties, and they just keep accumulating year after year, while everyone else chases the next shiny object. One of the most useful mental tools for thinking about money is inversion. Instead of asking, how do I get rich? Ask, how do I make sure I never get rich? And then avoid doing those things. Smart men go broke 3 ways: liquor, ladies, and leverage. The first 2 are mostly added for the alliteration because the real killer is leverage, which means debt and margin and borrowing money to invest. There's always a slight chance of catastrophe when you own securities pledged to others, and you can be exactly right about an investment and still get wiped out if you borrowed money to make it and the timing goes against you. Consider this scenario. You identify a wonderful business trading at a bargain price, and you're so confident that you borrow money to buy more of it. The stock drops 50% over the next year, not because you were wrong about the business, but because the market panics about something unrelated. Your broker calls, and you have to sell at the worst possible moment to meet the margin call. A year later, the stock is up 200%. From where you sold it, and you were right about everything except the timing, while the leverage destroyed you. This is why buying stocks on margin proves so dangerous. And it's not that you can't make money doing it. It's that the downside is asymmetric, meaning you can be right and still lose everything. The same principle applies to all forms of leverage, including that mortgage you can barely afford, that car payment that stretches your budget, and that lifestyle inflation that happens every time you get a raise. Every dollar of debt represents a claim against your future self, and every monthly payment is freedom you're selling to have something now instead of later. And here's the psychological trap. Debt makes you dependent. It makes you need your job, and it makes you need your boss's approval. It makes you unable to walk away from situations that are bad for you. The person with no savings and lots of debt is controlled by money, and they wake up every morning while money tells them what to do. Go to work at a job you hate. Stay in a relationship that's bad for you because you can't afford to leave, and accept treatment you shouldn't accept because you need the paycheck. The person with savings and no debt controls money instead. They wake up every morning and they tell money what to do. Work here, invest there, and if the job becomes intolerable or the relationship turns toxic, they can walk away. So that's the transformation we're talking about, and that's what changes when you accumulate your first real chunk of capital. I won't bet $100 against house odds between now and the grave. That's not because I can't afford to lose $100, but because the mentality that allows you to gamble against unfavorable odds is the same mentality that leads to much larger mistakes. You have to be consistent in your principles, or you'll find yourself rationalizing larger and larger deviations from rationality. Here's a concept that might seem counterintuitive. The goal is not to get rich because the goal is to become independent. These sound similar, but they lead to very different behaviors. The person trying to get rich is always comparing themselves to others and asking questions like, am I richer than my neighbor? Am I richer than my coworker? And am I richer than I was last year? This comparison never ends because there's always someone richer, and you could have $100 million and still feel poor because because you know someone with $1 billion. The person trying to become independent asks a different question. Do I have enough to live on my own terms? Can I say no to things I don't want to do? Can I walk away from people who mistreat me? And can I spend my time how I want to spend it? Once I had enough money of my own, I'd rather just operate with my own money. This is the mentality of independence, and it's not about accumulating the most, because it's about accumulating enough. Here's where this gets interesting. The amount required for independence is much smaller than most people think, and the amount required to feel rich is much larger than most people think. If your annual expenses are $50,000 and you have $500,000 invested returning 7%, you can cover most of your expenses without working. You're not flying private jets, but you're independent and you can take a job you love that pays less, or start a business without worrying about starving. You can tell your terrible boss exactly what you think of him. Meanwhile, the person with $2 million who spends $300,000 a year is actually less independent than you are. They need to keep generating high income to maintain their lifestyle, and they're trapped by their own spending. This is why the lifestyle you build matters as much as the money you accumulate. The person who learns to live well on less needs less capital to be free, and the person who inflates their lifestyle with every raise is building a prison disguised as a mansion. Consider the choices that follow from this understanding. You could live in a larger house that impresses your friends, or you could live in a modest house that provides what you actually need. The larger house costs more to buy, more to furnish, more to maintain, more to heat and cool, more to clean, and more to insure. Every dollar spent on the larger house is a dollar not working for your independence. Having watched many people who got rich build these really fancy houses, I would say in practically every case they make the person less happy rather than happier. Having a basic house really helps you, but having a really fancy house is good for entertaining 100 people at once, which is a very expensive thing to do, and it doesn't do you that much good. One wealthy investor lived in the same modest house for approximately 70 years, reportedly without air conditioning. During heat waves, friends brought electric fans and bags of ice to cool his library, and he could have afforded any house on earth but chose not to buy one. He understood that the point wasn't to look rich, because the point was to be free. He explained his philosophy directly when he said he decided not to live a life where he looked like some aristocrat or something, and he was going to avoid it on purpose. He didn't think it would be good for the children. This is wisdom that most people never discover. The appearance of wealth often conflicts with actual wealth, and the people who look richest are often the most leveraged, the most dependent, and the most trapped. The people who look middle class are sometimes the ones with the most freedom. Here's a paradox that most people never resolve. How do you know when you have enough? The honest answer is that most people never feel like they have enough, no matter how much they accumulate. This is a flaw in human psychology, rather than a flaw in their bank accounts. A happy life is very simple, because the first rule of a happy life is low expectations, and that's one you can easily arrange. If you have unrealistic expectations, you're going to be miserable all your life, and being good at having low expectations helps. This sounds pessimistic, but it's actually liberating. If you expect to need $10 million to be happy, you'll spend your whole life chasing that number and probably never reach it. If you expect that financial independence, meaning enough to cover your basic needs without working, is the goal, you can reach that much sooner and spend the rest of your life actually enjoying the freedom you've built. Consider the mathematics of comparison. The average person in a developed economy today lives better than kings did 200 years ago, because you have heating and cooling that Louis XIV couldn't imagine. You have entertainment options that would have stunned royalty. You have medicine that would seem like magic, and you can travel in hours distances that took weeks. And yet, people are miserable. It's weird how life was pretty brutal and short historically, but now things are enormously better, maybe 600% better in material terms, and yet people are less happy. They're less happy because they compare themselves to others rather than to historical baseline. You can't change the fact that a lot of people are very unhappy and feel very abused after everything's improved enormously because there's still somebody else who has more. This is the envy trap again. And the solution is not to accumulate more, because the solution is to stop comparing. When you reach your first $10,000, you have more liquid savings than the majority of people. $50,000 puts you in the top quartile, and when you reach a few $100,000, you have more than most people will accumulate in their entire lives. At some point, you have to decide that it's enough. And the person who decides early that a modest amount is enough often ends up happier than the person who spends their whole life chasing more. Now I'm going to tell you about a period that tests everything I've said so far, because accumulating money is one thing, while watching it disappear is something else entirely. In the early 1970s, a successful investor had built a thriving partnership with outstanding returns before the market crashed. In 1973, his fund lost 32%, and in 1974, it lost another 31%. Think about what that means mathematically. $1,000 at the beginning of 1973 became $467 by January of 1975, which represents a 53% loss over 2 years. Here's what's interesting about his response. He said the losses didn't bother him when it came to his own money, and what made him suffer was the loss of morale of the limited partners who had trusted him. This distinction matters. The money wasn't the issue because the psychology was the issue. He understood that market crashes are part of investing, and you cannot avoid them. You cannot time them, and you can only survive them. His lesson from that period: conduct your life so that you can handle the 50% decline with aplomb and grace. Don't try to avoid it, because it will come, and in fact, if it doesn't come, you're not being aggressive enough. Read that again. He's not saying you should try to avoid losing money, but rather that you should structure your life so that when you lose money, and you will lose money, it doesn't destroy you. This is why leverage proves so dangerous, why having savings matters, and why living below your means creates resilience. The person who has no savings and loses their job is in crisis, while the person who has 2 years of expenses saved can look at a job loss as an opportunity to find something better. The person who is fully invested on margin when the market drops 50% is wiped out, while the person who invested only money they didn't need can wait for the recovery. The partnership that lost 53% in 2 years recovered with a 73% gain in 1975. Over its lifetime, it returned nearly 20% annually, compared to 5% for the general market. But you had to survive the bad years to enjoy the good ones. If you need the money during the crash, you're forced to sell at the worst possible time. If you can wait, the recovery eventually comes. This is why the first $10,000 matters so much. And it's not about the returns you'll earn on it. It's about the cushion it creates and the psychological security of knowing you can survive a setback. What actually changes when you go from having nothing to having a foundation of capital is worth describing. When nothing is saved, every unexpected expense becomes a crisis. The car breaks down, and you're scrambling to find the money. You get sick and miss work, and you're worried about the bills. You see an opportunity, a chance to start a business or take a better job in another city, but you can't take it because you have no cushion. Money controls you and tells you what you can and cannot do. It limits your options and forces you into decisions you don't want to make. When you have a foundation, whether that's $10,000 or $50,000 or more, everything changes. The car breaks down, and it's an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. You get sick, and you focus on recovery rather than finances. You see an opportunity, and you can actually evaluate it on its merits rather than being forced to say no because you're broke. You start controlling money, and you tell it what to do. You allocate it according to your priorities, rather than letting emergencies dictate everything. This is the transformation from scarcity to agency, and it happens at a surprisingly low threshold. You don't need to be a millionaire because you just need enough that you're not living crisis to crisis. Once you experience this transformation, you never want to go back because the security becomes more valuable than any purchase you could make. Every time you're tempted to spend your savings on something you don't need, you remember what it felt like to have nothing, and you choose freedom over stuff. I don't want to go back to zero because I've been to zero, and I don't want to go back. This is the psychology of someone who has crossed the threshold. They protect their capital not out of greed, but out of a deep appreciation for what that capital means, not as money, but as freedom. What actually prevents people from building this foundation comes down to a few specific dangers. The first danger is impatience. People want results immediately, and they see the boring math of compound interest, which looks like save $500 a month for 30 years, and they think that takes too long. So they chase shortcuts by day trading, gambling, buying lottery tickets, and investing in things they don't understand because someone promised quick returns. Great investing requires a lot of delayed gratification. The people who are into deferred gratification, really committed to it, often get rich. In fact, most of them will defer gratification all the way to the end and die with a lot of money. That's what tends to happen, and it does cause you to get rich. The second danger is self-pity. Things go wrong and people feel victimized, so they blame the unfair economy, their terrible boss, or the advantages that other people had. And because they feel victimized, they don't take responsibility for changing their situation. Whenever you think that some situation or some person is ruining your life, it's actually you who are ruining your life. Feeling like a victim is a perfectly disastrous way to go through life. This is uncomfortable to hear because sometimes people genuinely are treated unfairly, but that's not the point. What matters is whether self-pity helps, and the answer is clearly no. Self-pity doesn't fix your situation and just makes you miserable while your situation stays the same. Envy, resentment, revenge, and self-pity are disastrous modes of thought, and self-pity gets fairly close to paranoia. Every time you find yourself drifting into self-pity, no matter what the cause, and your child could be dying from cancer, self-pity is not going to improve the situation. The third danger is what might be called lifestyle creep. You get a raise and your spending goes up by exactly the same amount, and you never accumulate anything because your lifestyle expands to consume everything you make. This proves particularly insidious because it doesn't feel like a mistake while it's happening. You deserve the nicer apartment, you've earned the better car, and you work hard. So why shouldn't you enjoy some luxuries? The problem is that every dollar spent on lifestyle inflation is a dollar that could have been working for your independence. And once you inflate your lifestyle, deflating it feels like deprivation, even though you lived happily at the lower level before. The people who build wealth spend less than they make. And I mean grossly less rather than 10% less. 30 or 40% less is what I'm talking about. They take the gap between income and spending and put it to work year after year until the compounding becomes significant. What a successful wealth-building journey actually looks like probably isn't what you're imagining. A man started with $1,500 in savings and a job paying $3,300 per year when he was 25 years old and freshly graduated from law school. Over the next decade or so, he slowly accumulated capital by living modestly and investing what he could. By his late 30s, he had accumulated roughly $300,000, which represented about 10 years of family living expenses. This doesn't sound like a story of getting rich quick because it isn't. Building that foundation took more than a decade of working and saving. But here's what that foundation enabled. He could start his own law firm instead of working for someone else. He could start his own investment partnership, and he could take risks that would have been impossible without the cushion. His investment partnership went on to return 37% annually, and he participated in real estate developments that turned $100,000 into $500,000, which is a 400% profit. Within a few years, he had accumulated a few $1 million from combined investment returns and real estate, and he had achieved financial independence. He no longer needed to work for money. But notice how the story developed. The first decade was slow accumulation that was boring with no dramatic moments, just steady saving and investing. Then the second decade brought dramatic growth, but only because he had the foundation to take advantage of opportunities. If you took the top 15 decisions out of a typical successful investor's career, they'd have a pretty average record. It wasn't hyperactivity because it was a hell of a lot of patience, sticking to principles, and when opportunities came along, pouncing on them with vigor. The opportunities only mattered because he had capital to deploy, and the patience only paid off because he stuck around long enough for the opportunities to arrive. Here's the honest truth about money and happiness. If all you succeed in doing in life is getting rich by buying little pieces of paper, it's a failed life, because life is more than being shrewd in wealth accumulation. This might seem like a strange way to end a speech about building financial independence, but it's essential to understand because otherwise the pursuit of money becomes its own form of slavery. The point of accumulating money is not the money itself. The point is freedom to spend your time how you want, freedom to work on problems you find interesting, freedom to associate with people you actually like, and freedom to say no. Once you have that freedom, accumulating more money doesn't make you more free, because it just means you have more money. And more money beyond what you need for independence doesn't actually improve your life very much. The safest way to try and get what you want is to try and deserve what you want. And it's such a simple idea. It's the golden rule. And by and large, the people who have this ethos win in life. They don't win just money and honors, because they win the respect, the deserved trust of the people they deal with. And there is huge pleasure in life to be obtained from getting deserved trust. So here's the framework. First, accumulate enough capital that money stops controlling you, because the first $10,000 is hard and the first $100,000 is harder. But once you have a foundation, everything changes. Second, don't interrupt the compounding unnecessarily, because the big money is in the waiting. Be patient, have a long attention span, and let time do its work. Third, avoid the obvious mistakes by not using leverage, not gambling, not chasing get-rich-quick schemes, not comparing yourself to others, and not letting envy drive your decisions. Fourth, recognize when you have enough, because independence is the goal, rather than maximum accumulation. Once you can live on your own terms, you've won. Fifth, use your freedom well by building something, helping people, developing relationships based on mutual respect rather than mutual need, and earning trust by being trustworthy. Spend each day trying to be a little wiser than you were when you woke up, and discharge your duties faithfully and well. Systematically, you get ahead, but not necessarily in fast spurts. And nevertheless, you build discipline by preparing for fast spurts. Slug it out 1 inch at a time, day by day, and at the end of the day, if you live long enough, most people get what they deserve. And one final thought. For those of you who are young or feel like you're running out of time, if you got anything you really want to do, don't wait. Don't defer everything to some imaginary future when you'll finally have enough. Build the foundation, yes, and be patient with your investments, yes, but live your life along the way. The people who defer gratification completely, who save every penny, and never enjoy anything, often end up with a lot of money and a lot of regret. That's not the goal either. The goal is a life that makes sense, which means independence, freedom, meaningful work, relationships built on trust rather than need, and enough money that you never have to worry about money again. That's what changes when you accumulate your first real capital. And it's not the amount in the account. It's the relationship you have with money itself. Money stops controlling you, and you start controlling money. And that changes everything.